Would you believe me if I told you that your favorite fairy tale is actually a story about death, transformation, and divine intervention? Hello, welcome to the Numinous Eye. I'm so glad you're here. This is a space where we explore the intersection of religion and pop culture by interpreting the spiritual symbolism hidden inside the stories you know and love. If you're new here, hi, I'm your host, Samantha. I'm a scholar of comparative religions and English literature, and it's a passion of mine to discuss the fascinating world of spiritual philosophy and the many ways it manifests in art, from film and music to novels and television. So if that's your cup of tea, stick around and let's get into the video. Today we're looking at one of the most recognizable fairy tales in the world, Cinderella. But not the cozy, wholesome Disney princess tale that comes to mind. We're going back in time to 1812 Germany to study the story as told by the Brothers Grimm. Whether you've read it or not, you're probably aware that this version, Aschenputtel, is much darker and more gruesome than the 1950 Disney adaptation. That's because the animated film was largely based on Charles Perrault's 1697 French version, which gave us the iconic glass slipper. A close look at the Brothers Grimm version reveals that it's a really good example of something called spiritual syncretism. And spiritual syncretism is the merging of two or more faith traditions into one narrative or system. And we see this a lot in things like holidays. The most obvious example being Christmas, when you see elements of both paganism and Christianity combined. Likewise, in the case of Aschenputtel, what we can identify are elements of Germanic paganism alongside this Protestant Christian framework that dominated Europe at the time of the Brothers Grimm. As they set out to collect some of the most popular oral folk tales of the time, the Brothers Grimm were no doubt influenced by their strict religious upbringing as Reformed Calvinists. They are known for adding moralistic and largely Christian elements to the stories, while retaining much of the traditional pagan themes in order to appeal to their contemporary audiences, whose belief systems were likely some mashup of the two. So let's begin by exploring some of these symbols. The name Aschenputtel literally translates to ash girl in German, and here we have our first symbol. The orphan Cinderella is forced by her stepmother to become the family's servant. For warmth, she sleeps at the hearth and is always covered in ashes. Ashes represent destruction, rebirth, and transformation, and they evoke imagery of the phoenix, a magical being reborn from its own remains. Alchemy tells of ashes refined into gold through a process of purification, and with her magical slippers, Cinderella embodies this kind of metamorphosis. Despite all her suffering, or perhaps because of it, she emerges from the ashes victorious and ready to begin a new life with her husband, the prince. This interpretation is reinforced by Harold Bailey in his 1912 book, The Lost Language of Symbolism. He talks about how Cinderella can be interpreted as an allegory for the spiritual transformation of the soul. Another important symbol in the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella is the hazel tree. After her mother's death, Cinderella plants a hazel twig on her grave and waters it with her own tears. And from her grief grows a tree. Now, in European folk traditions, hazel trees are associated with fertility, protection from evil spirits, and the divine feminine. It has uses in ritual practices surrounding birth and marriage, and here the tree acts as a living extension of Cinderella's mother and a symbol of nature's maternal spirit. Her relationship with the tree is reminiscent of pagan ancestor veneration. She sings to it and makes offerings, and from the tree she receives gifts, such as the gown and golden slippers that she wears to the royal ball. Now, among the branches of the hazel tree sit two white birds who grant Cinderella's wishes. This is another powerful symbol. Later at her wedding, the birds enact revenge on her behalf by plucking out the eyes of her cruel stepsisters. In a pagan reading, these birds resemble animistic spirits, or messengers between worlds. But here we can also interpret a deeply Christian message, as white doves are most often associated with the Holy Spirit. The white bird in this story is an embodiment of God, whom her mother had always promised would watch out for her so long as she just stayed good and pure. With her dying words, the mother is reinforcing Christian values. Our heroine fulfills the role of a good Christian girl by honoring her mother's wishes and remaining obedient and respectful to her parents, even her wicked stepmother. In the face of cruelty, she turns the other cheek. Her wishes and prayers are thus granted, and she is lifted out of her misery. In contrast, the story reinforces the Christian belief in sin and divine retribution, when Cinderella's stepsisters are blinded by the birds. We might look to Exodus 21:24, which says, "Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot." As the sisters have both mutilated their feet by the end of the story, and now lost their eyes, this reads like a conscious reference to biblical systems of justice. We might also look to what blindness represents biblically, which is a separation from divinity. In the book of Acts, for example, we have the story of Saul, who's blinded by Jesus for 3 days and only redeemed after he repents and surrenders to God, shedding his name to become Paul the Apostle. Christian audiences in 1812 would have likely picked up on this subtext in Aschenputtel, understanding that the stepsisters still had a chance at forgiveness, so long as they repented for their sins. It's important in any literary analysis to understand how stories evolve and change over time, and to see where some of this spiritual messaging might differ depending on who's telling the story. So we can look at some modern remakes of Cinderella to see where this occurs. Disney's 1950 animated adaptation omits many religious elements entirely, offering instead a whimsical, secular fantasy more aligned with mid-century American values. The sacred tree is replaced by the fairy godmother, and animals act as comic relief rather than spiritual guides. And although some themes like purity remain strong, the Christian influence is less obvious overall. While the Brothers Grimm version emphasizes the dualistic nature of good versus evil that is fundamental to Christianity, modern adaptations tend to offer nuanced perspectives. Take Kenneth Branagh's live-action remake in 2015, for example, which gave audiences a chance to empathize with Cinderella's wicked stepmother, who, as an aging widow, experiences both grief and the pressure to maintain social class in a patriarchal world. In this version, Cinderella leaves her stepfamily with one final declaration: "I forgive you." Her choice to forgive cruelty rather than avenge for it reflects trends in modern psychology, which find younger generations breaking cycles of trauma and abuse through emotional regulation and inner child healing. This goes to show how contemporary fairy tales are influenced less by religious moral codes than by conventional ones. The Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella is a perfect example of spiritual syncretism in literature. We have the intersection of folk paganism and Christianity combined. But it is only through a lens that honors both of these traditions that we gain a deeper understanding of the fairy tale as a whole. This is exactly the kind of work I like to do here on the Numinous Eye. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, consider subscribing, and stick around as we continue to explore the meaning hidden in plain sight. Until next time, keep those eyes open.